Seems like every time missiles start flying, people go, is this World War III? My read of the situation is we've kind of been in World War III since, you could say, COVID, if you're being a bit more conspiratorial, or at least since the Russia-Ukraine war popped off. And we just, with the way great power conflict and regional conflicts unfold now, when you have nuclear powers in a tightly integrated global system that's dominated by elite political factions that function almost as competing mafias. They don't really want to fight head to head, right? They don't really want to have to fight, true large scale kinetic wars with other great powers, because those could destroy the whole planet and could certainly lead to massive loss of wealth for the elites in those political systems. So what we've seen is essentially kind of proxy wars, wars in space, assassinations, sabotage campaigns, cyber attacks, and kind of this arc of instability across the Eurasian periphery, which sort of structures this global conflict that's playing out between, you could say, the Eurasian sort of autocratic powers, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and then kind of the legacy sort of Western international sort of security regime underpinned by the US as the global hegemon, but kind of the Great Oceania, right? Kind of mostly most of your sort of maritime, commercial sort of capitalist countries, US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the UK, and Israel. And so you have kind of this sort of meta narrative, which is kind of this competition between global orders and kind of insurgent powers, kind of rising powers, wanting to challenge the legacy system. And then finding friends, right, to kind of do, variations of alignment with. And that's kind of maybe what you have with kind of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And so you have kind of these local versions of this conflict, Russia, Ukraine. You have other Russian and Western conflicts that are much more sub rosa in the North Sea, in the Arctic, in space, and other, more deniable things. And then you have, the Iran-Israel kind of flashpoint that has had lots of other sort of regional manifestations. You have you have India-Pakistan. You have kind of latent conflict, the subject of a lot of speculation when or if, right, between China and Taiwan. Then you have North Korea, always a bit of a wild card there. So you've got kind of this arc of instability here. And you could call that World War III in the sense that there are regional conflicts that have their own sort of local character and their own sort of history to those sort of adversarial relationships. But they're linked into this global frame, right? And that every conflict is bringing in other regional and global powers, right? It's the reason why Russia-Ukraine isn't just a Russia-Ukraine thing, right? It's essentially a whole Western security apparatus, and then Russia getting support from both Iran, North Korea, and China, right? This is kind of the globalization of these local conflicts. And so when you say World War III, it's sort of the implication is going back to other world wars that started local, like Austria-Hungary, right? Serbian, assassinations that pulled in more and more belligerents until you had basically the entire world, thrown down. And, I think what we've seen thus far is we don't have the same sort of balance of power dynamic where you have all these sort of chains of alliance and mutual defense treaties, right? Where it's all of a sudden one thing pops off and then everyone is going to war. We have Article 5 of NATO that's obviously Ukraine isn't party to, so that's kind of kept it mitigated. Israel, we have a sort of mutual defense, but it's mostly arms supplies, and then depending on how things go, we could get involved. So I see this Israel-Iran conflict. It's been playing out for a long time, and clearly this was a flashpoint that the political leadership decided to take in the context of Trump now coming into office. I think the most recent indications are, one, it was immensely successful, maybe more successful than Israel even anticipated. They wiped out large swaths of the military and scientific establishment. They apparently had significant strikes on some of the nuclear enrichment facilities, Natanz and Fordow, although Fordow, we'll see if those are deeply buried, and really kind of embarrassed the Iranians. Basically took down most of the air defense systems and pretty much have been operating unopposed in Iranian skies, it seems, which is a demonstration of just technical prowess, right? Strategic surprise, and builds on sort of, previous sort of Israeli operations of similar sort of, strategic stealth going after the Hezbollah leadership, the pager attack. There's various assassinations that they've conducted that have been very much sort of precision pinpoint strikes inside Iran. And so I think Trump, his most recent statements today essentially indicated hey, Iran, I gave you 60 days. I wanted you to come to the table to negotiate a grand bargain. I think the contours of that grand bargain were you give up your ambitions to a nuclear weapon, and we'll help basically facilitate the development of a civilian and highly sort of regulated nuclear industry, will unlock a bunch of frozen funds, remove some sanctions, allow you to kind of economically develop and get rich. And that was like 61 days ago. And so he said 61 days are up. And now he gives the green light for Bibi to go and start murking some guys, including some of the guys that he said, were on the other end of this negotiating table. And he's like, well, they're dead now, right? And so there's like a kind of it was almost kind of darkly comical in the sense that like Trump was like, almost bragging about the guys that were like being hard asses on the other side of the negotiating table. They're dead now. So if you want to replace those people, Iran, maybe you should send people that are going to be a bit more cooperative. It was pretty blatant with that. I'm skeptical this will like lead to like a total conflagration in the region. I think we've had lots of occasions of missiles flying back and forth. And I think the biggest reason why is that Iran is actually now looks not very strong at all, right? I didn't see a single Russian fighter trying to intercept, an Israeli fighter. And the fact that Mossad was able to operate with a large footprint in country means they had a massive network of in-country facilitators. And the fact that they were able to target so many of these senior military and, important people at the same time means that they can track these people pretty well from the outside, but like to get like where they sleep in their bedrooms, right? Like across like all these different cities and hit them all in real time means that they had extremely strong in-country intelligence. In fact, I somewhat suspect, although it's definitely a little bit more of a speculation, that they probably have more than just an intelligence network inside the country, but probably have a set of individuals in the political apparatus that are very much opposed to kind of these hardline Islamist faction that wants to take the country to war. And, if Israel is there to kind of wipe out your political opponents for you, all you have to do is like help them out with where they sleep, and boom, like most of your opposition is dead inside that country. It's kind of a win-win for you. So we'll see. I think in general, like I try to fade geopolitical risk, right? It's always a sell the news or buy the news, right? Event. There's obviously failure modes here where very bad things could happen. I think the worst case scenario would be like an attempt by Iran to try to close the Strait of Hormuz or to conduct large scale terrorist attacks in the West. Because if it looks like they can't actually respond kinetically, which it looks like they really can't. They tried launching some drones. Almost all of them got intercepted. Their command and control apparatus is basically in tatters. They could reconstitute it, but we'll see. And meanwhile, Israel was able to strike a lot of their ballistic missiles and just kind of defang them, it looks like. And we'll see, right? It's been only a day or so right. I don't want to be too premature in judging it. But if they can't, credibly respond in a way that, allows them to maintain a bit of dignity, then they'll turn to their asymmetric options, which are, essentially their terror cells that they've established overseas, a lot in South America, a lot even in North America and in Western Europe, to attack, sort of softer targets and to try to, impose pain in retaliation. And what that then triggers as a Western counter-response, depending on how deadly they are, could be the thing that tips over Western public opinion, right, to engage much more militarily in like a regime change operation, which I think is the main thing that is like dividing the kind of MAGA movement or the national security apparatus inside the Trump administration, which is, I think divided between like Iran hawks, the kind of, the Lindsey Grahams of the world that are just like out for blood, and the folks that even include, Vice President Vance, which is, he was a Marine, and his whole line has been no more foreign wars in the Middle East, right? No more, getting dragged down into these interminable conflicts where it's often the poor that bleed out in the desert to fight for the elites. So I think there's a strong opposition to U.S. engagement, with boots on the ground or with anything that could trigger a larger conflict. Israel certainly wants to try to bring us in, because if they really want to take out the nuclear program for good and not just set it back a few months, they would need U.S. strike support. And so I think that's what they're trying to angle for. And it's been a bit of a rambling assessment, the last point I would make is I think the most important thing that Israel is trying to get out of the next few days and weeks, as they're going to continue these sort of rolling targeted strikes, one, their amount of sorties they can field is limited. Even if they've established air supremacy, they just don't have. It's a long way for those fighters to fly. Eventually hitting these deeply buried targets requires munitions that the Israeli military may not actually have or have in sufficient quantities to have a strategic effect. So they might need U.S. munitions or strike support with these with targeting these deeply buried facilities like at Fordo, which is like 200 feet in the rock with the centrifuges. So I think Bibi's line here is to Trump now, hey, look, like we got their pants down. Like they're vulnerable. Like if you just ante up just a bit, send a few more strikes in to help take out these facilities, like we can turn this from a months-long setback to a years-long setback and dramatically improve your negotiating position. And I think for Trump, who is very much always like a, go by his, vibe in the moment kind of decision maker, I could see him getting convinced to support some targeted strikes on some of these critical facilities, where it's like once you've popped the seal of hitting Iran, and if you're expecting Iran to retaliate kind of regardless, well, you might as well just go all the way, right? Then the question is, if you knock out their nuclear program, not for good, but like very much substantially, then you get to this next point, which is then the Israelis go, well, look, we basically pants them. We've knocked out their air supremacy, knocked out the nuclear program. We've killed most of their senior generals in both the Quds Force and the military, the chief of staff, a lot of the intelligence systems. Let's just go for Khamenei. Let's just take him out, right? Like full on, like regime change. That term regime change, right, has very much like gets people start to scratch, right? And that would be very much a radical proposition a few weeks ago. But if you get to this point where each incremental strike looks like it's easier than you thought, well, then actually changing the political environment inside Iran becomes less of an impossible proposition. And there's a lot of people inside the national security apparatus that are going to constantly be chirping in that direction. So I guess that's the thing to watch. Not World War III, but just does the ratchet of successful strikes increase the chance of U.S. engagement? Because Trump wants to basically get the most leverage he can. And the last point, would be, think about Iran in the context of the China trade war and negotiations there. There was, that's the main dynamic that Trump is kind of concerned by, in the sense that China has a lot of leverage over us. We have a lot of leverage over China. We're somewhat equally matched. Like we basically came to blows, Liberation Day, massive tariffs, almost a mutual embargo. That started creating almost economic catastrophe inside China, because you have entire cities that are just like, now don't have an economic purpose if they can't export. And so there's a lot of potential internal instability being triggered, as well as financial instability in the West, right? If you have inflation, you have bond market instability, you have 5% plus 30-year that Besson started getting worried about, high move index, sort of mutually assured economic destruction. And so we kind of came to the table in Geneva, and then it just had the most recent meetings and phone calls to try to recalibrate, come to a quote deal. And a lot of it was like the rare earth stuff, the Chinese student stuff. But I think Trump wasn't like a master planner looking at all of the, advantages and disadvantages. He just was like, let's go for it. Let's figure it out. And now I think he's now discovered kind of just how much leverage China has over us, and also how much leverage maybe we have over them, but like where the actual points of leverage and pain are. And I think he's looking at Iran and realizing that Iran exports 2 million barrels of oil a day, mostly to China, and if China's choking off your rare earths, maybe you can, help choke off some of their energy supply, right? So it's like another sort of asymmetric way to kind of, get additional sort of bargaining power over your main rival, which is China here.